Hey guys, today we are getting into the topics of revolutions. So, last week, just to refresh real quick, we were talking about the Enlightenment ideas, where people throughout Europe were starting to really question why are humans working with each other the way that they are. We start to see this idea of natural law, having a social contract with each other, and people started to have philosophies of like, people are naturally good, people are naturally bad, here's what governments need to do for us. And governments started to respond by trying to censor people, and the government and churches were not very happy about these new ideas coming about because it was challenging their order. And so the government, the church started to kind of spread this message of if you're challenging us, you're challenging God. Okay, so we need to just kind of review some of those ideas as we're getting into this. So, as we are going through this slideshow, what I want you to do is keep these questions in mind. What is the best way to seek change? Through words or actions? So, if you want something to be changed, do you need to physically see it, or do you think you can change people's opinions by using words? Okay, so we're going to keep that kind of big overarching question in the back of our head over the next couple of weeks as we're taking a look at the American Revolution and the French Revolution. So, jumping into it right away, last we talked, we got colonies set up by the French, the British, and the Spanish. We know why they kind of all settled in the regions that they did. If you see here on the right-hand side, these pictures, we've got the British Empire flag. Okay, so that's kind of a symbol throughout the world at this time. The bottom right-hand corner, you see a world map. And you see a lot of things that are covered in red. Well, anything that is red on this map was a part of the British Empire. Okay, so we see England having colonies in the Americas, in the Indies, Indian region, Asia, all throughout Africa, and they're really starting to take over, making profit off of the different regions that they have under their control. And they were very prosperous. They were very successful at making money off of all these different goods. Where they had settled, their colonies in the different regions had a really good climate, so they were able to make a lot of money, produce a lot of different natural goods that could then be exported and sold around the rest of the world. They were also becoming this massive empire because they were winning a lot of wars during this time. Okay, they had wars that were going on in Europe as well as different wars that were happening in order to gain new territory and land in the Americas. One, for example, was the French and Indian War. Now, this was not the French versus Indians. This was the French and Indians, Native Americans, against the English. And they were fighting over that territory, especially in the northeastern colonies, what we think of today as like New York, Pennsylvania, Maine, Vermont. Okay, so fighting over those regions as well as going westward. So they won and they gained new territory. Okay, so they gained that territory that was previously owned by France. So now they are having territory up into what is current day Michigan, Indiana, Ohio, Tennessee, Kentucky, really expanding that empire, again with good climate, making more money off of the different products that are being grown. Because they started to expand their empire and had a lot of different colonial settlements, they also took over the slave trade from the Spanish. And again, that was a lot of money being exchanged in return for people. Again, just growing their empire larger and larger. So good climate, they're winning wars, getting more territory, and taking over a lot of the economy of the world at this time. So let's focus now on the American colonies. Okay, so as we know, the English kind of settled because they were either looking for new resources in the Jamestown settlements or they were looking for religious freedoms in the Plymouth, Massachusetts settlements. So the colonists, right, they're colonists. They are not English citizens. And they were so far away, so disconnected from the English. They literally have an ocean between them, separating them. they wanted to have rights. They didn't want to just be like these people that lived on a territory. They wanted to have different freedoms that were guaranteed to the English back in the home country. And as we're going through more and more history, right, we have more families and more generational divide, where after a couple of generations, the people living in North America, they didn't view themselves as English. They viewed themselves as American colonists. And so that loyalty, that respect for the crown, just wasn't really being passed along from generation to generation. So this is the background of it leading up to the French and Indian War, also known as the 7 Years' War. Obviously, we know already that the British won this war, right? They got that territory, including Michigan, Ohio, and up into the northeastern colonies. Now, wars are expensive. You have to feed your soldiers, you have to clothe your soldiers, arm them with weapons. Okay, it takes a lot of funds in order to fight in a war. So even though the British won the French and Indian War, they were still in a lot of debt, right? And they needed to make up that money. And so King George III, who was the king during the mid to late 1700s, he wanted the colonists to pay for the debt through taxes. In his mind, he thought, hey, I just fought this war for you. I protected you. You should be thankful that I did this for you. Well, on the other side, the colonists kept thinking, we didn't ask for this, so why should we have to pay for wars that you started? Okay, so some of the taxes that King George III started to put onto the colonists in order, again, to make up is we've got the Sugar Act, which meant that anyone living in the colonies had to pay extra money on any sugar coming into their land. Now, sugar was very, very popular. It was used to flavor a lot of goods. Okay, and so because it was such a high commodity, highly valued, of course, everyone is going to be buying it. So now everyone is having to pay a lot of extra money, again, making up for this debt for a war that the colonists never asked for. We also have the Stamp Act, which put a tax on any newspapers, pamphlets, basically any kind of paper good that was going to be distributed throughout the region. So the colonists would go into a postmaster's office or into the governor's office, and they had to get an official stamp of approval, obviously after paying some money, in order to send it, like a letter. You had to get a stamp in order to send it as a letter. So obviously, the colonists started to grow really angry. Again, they didn't want this war, they don't want these taxes, and they still don't have this loyalty, right? Their generation separated from England. They aren't seeing any of the money in return that's happening back in England, back in Europe. So they're getting really upset about constantly having to pay for the problems of other people. So in return, the colonists have what's called the Boston Massacre, and this is what you see as the image here on this slide. The Boston Massacre happened in Boston, Massachusetts. Now, the story is that a group of British soldiers who were patrolling the streets started to open fire on citizens, which is the image that is portrayed here, right? It looks really, really innocent of the citizens. It looks like they're defenseless, don't have any weapons. It makes the British soldiers look really bad, right? Well, obviously, propaganda was a thing. This image is actually doctored in order to make the British look worse than they actually were. The truth of the story is the colonists started to throw snowballs at the British soldiers as they were walking by. And not only were they just snowballs made of snow, but they also had rocks that were in the center of them. So the colonists, a group of civilians, were throwing rocks and hitting the British soldiers. Obviously, people kind of carried weapons on them at the time, and it just erupted into this small town squabble. It wasn't a whole town that got massacred. It was a couple of people, again, because of this incident of starting with snowballs. But either way, because of the recreated images that ended up being sent out across the countryside, this became a big moment in history where colonists thought, wow, we are getting attacked by the British soldiers now for no reason against defenseless colonists, and people started to get really, really angry about what was going on. We also have the Boston Tea Party, which takes place, where again the colonists are upset about the different taxes that are being placed on them. And so, as a form of protest, a group of colonists or patriots came together at night. They dressed up in disguises and they went into the Boston Harbor and threw over the edges of the boats there all of the goods that the British were trying to bring into the city. So, because they destroyed those goods, the British weren't able to make any money off of the taxes because they couldn't sell the goods. Just another form of protest. So we see some moments of looking for change by the art that is sent out across the countryside, right? Whether it's a true story or not, we see it as art. And then these moments of action, of going into the harbor, destroying goods that they didn't agree with for the philosophy. So we get into this revolution now where people are starting to become very physical. On July 4th, 1776, the American colonists declare independence from Britain. And in this declaration, right, they literally sign a letter. And they write a letter to the King of England where they talk about how they should have a right to life, liberty, and pursuit of happiness. Now, that's going to sound really familiar to our Enlightenment philosopher from last week, John Locke, who believed that everyone had these natural rights. And his philosophy was that everyone had the right to life, liberty, and property. Now, fun fact, the colonists didn't want to include that piece of property because there was a group of the population that they didn't want to own land, such as women, Native Americans, and African Americans who are slaves during this time. So, they also included in this letter that the people had the right to abolish their government if they were no longer happy with what the government was doing for them. Again, another Enlightenment idea that we kind of saw last week from our great philosopher John Locke. They end up electing George Washington as the leader of the Continental Army, and they officially start out into seeking independence from England. Now, we're going to take a look at the Declaration of Independence later this week, but just know these are some of those big ideas, some of those Enlightenment ideas that we saw that are now influencing the people to seek change. Now, we're not going to spend a ton of time on like war movements, where soldiers were moving to, that kind of stuff, because you've already spent a lot of time talking about the American Revolution back in middle school U.S. history. But just as to round it out, again, we're kind of looking at impact of previous world movements. The colonists did end up being very successful in winning the war because they had a lot of background on the countryside. They knew how to work the land, they knew how to survive the climate, especially as winters came into play, and the British just weren't able to hold their ground. They didn't understand how to survive in a country or in a territory like North America. So out of getting this moment of revolution, gaining independence, the colonists established the United States of America, which is a new country. So I said a couple of minutes ago that we're going to see the Founding Fathers use a lot of those Enlightenment ideas that we talked about last week, right? They had a lot of great influences from their studies of John Locke, Montesquieu, Rousseau. So let's break those down here real quick to just again see what was the impact of that education from those philosophers a couple of decades earlier. We see that a government is a social contract, right? That we as humans are agreeing to interact with each other under these certain rules, right? Without rules, we as humans are literally just animals interacting around one another. There's nothing that really stops us. So having a government in place is our agreement to each other of, I'll act this way, you act that way. Our new country, newly called the United States of America, became known as a type of government as a federal republic. Now, this means that power is divided between state and national powers. So, if you think about it, right, we have a federal leader who is our president, and then we have a state leader who is our governor. And each work with each other, but they also have completely different roles in how they are going to help the people of their territory or their region. We also have branches of government. As you can see here on the right, we have the executive branch, the judicial branch, and the legislative branch. We have a Bill of Rights, where people have basic rights at birth. So, for example, freedom of speech, freedom of religion, freedom of the press. We have the right to bear arms. All of these different rights you get as soon as you are born here in the United States. If you are a U.S. citizen, you are guaranteed these rights. So we're going to see a lot of these ideas, right? These were just like poor farmers off of the countryside. They just gained independence from this huge, massive, really rich empire that has control over a lot of the rest of the world. Well, other countries that are starting to become corrupt, or the general population are no longer happy with those who are in power. This was a moment that sparked revolution throughout the world. A lot of smaller countries, a lot of oppressed countries are going to look at the US and see, wow, those people were able to gain independence. We can too. And they started to look at, how did the colonists do it? What tactics did they use? And it truly was a mixture of using words as well as actions. Okay, so we're going to see later this week, we're going to see words used asking for change as we look at the Declaration of Independence. There's some really powerful words that come into play there. And then we're going to see these actions, right? Like the Boston Massacre, the massacre, the Tea Party, things like that. Right? So as you're leaving, walking away from this, again, and this is your opinion, we've kind of seen some examples through history now. My question still to you is, what is the best way to seek change, through words or actions? Now, when I ask you this is not only like a historical question, but it's also a question for you to think about how you advocate for yourself. If you're unhappy about something going on in your life, are you going to talk to someone about it and ask them for things, or are you going to expect actions? Are you going to act out physically in order to see some type of change? Does it work? Does it not? That's for you to decide. We'll see you guys later.